Sir, weddings like this don't usually let the help sit at the family table. The wedding planner's name was Delphine, and she had a clipboard, a headset, and absolutely no idea that the man she was about to insult owned the mortgage on the very ballroom she was standing in. "Sir," she said, touching Daniel Reyes lightly on the elbow the way you'd redirect a lost delivery driver. "The family table is just for immediate family. If you're with catering, the staff entrance is around back past the kitchen." Daniel looked down at her hand on his sleeve, then up at her face, and said nothing for a moment. It wasn't anger that kept him quiet. It was the old, familiar quiet he'd worn for 2 decades like a second skin. The quiet of a man who had learned that the loudest rooms in his life had once been the ones where he said the least. "I'm the father of the bride," he said. Delphine's smile flickered, recalibrated, then locked itself back into place with the practiced ease of someone who apologizes for a living. "Of course, my mistake. It's just the seating chart has Mr. Reyes listed at table 2, and I assumed—" "You assumed," Daniel said, "based on the suit." He didn't say it unkindly. He said it the way a man states a fact he has made peace with a long time ago. The suit was 3 years old, Navy bought off the rack from a store in Hartford that did alterations for $40 extra. He'd chosen it on purpose. He always chose things on purpose. Across the ballroom, under a canopy of white orchids that had cost more than most people's cars, his daughter Claire stood in the dress that made her look like her mother. So much like her mother that Daniel had to look away from her twice already that evening just to keep his composure. She was laughing at something her soon-to-be mother-in-law had said, the kind of laugh that didn't reach the eyes, the kind Claire had perfected around this family over the past year. Margaret Harrington moved through her son's wedding like a woman inspecting a hotel she was thinking of buying. She missed nothing. She noticed the caterer refilling the wrong glasses first. She noticed her husband Robert loosening his tie half an inch too early. And she noticed from 30 feet away the wedding planner's hand still hovering near the elbow of a man in a suit that did not belong at the head table of a Harrington wedding. "Delphine," Margaret said, arriving the way weather arrives, you felt the pressure change before you saw her. "Is there a problem?" "No, Mrs. Harrington, I was just—" "This is my father," Claire said quickly, appearing at Daniel's side with the particular speed of a daughter trying to get ahead of a disaster. "Dad, this is Ethan's mom." Margaret's eyes went over Daniel the way a customs officer's eyes go over a suspicious suitcase. Quick, thorough, already forming conclusions. The suit. The shoes polished but clearly resoled, at least once. The watch a simple steel thing with a leather band gone soft with age. "How lovely," Margaret said in the tone people use for weather they don't like. "Claire's told us so little about you. I understand you're between positions at the moment." "I'm retired," Daniel said. "Retired," Margaret repeated, letting the word sit there like she'd caught it doing something wrong. "From business," Daniel said. It was technically entirely true, and he watched Margaret decide it was a euphemism for something smaller. A warehouse foreman, maybe. Or a man had driven a truck for 30 years and was proud of a pension that wouldn't cover this ballroom's flower budget. He let her decide it. He always let people decide things about him. It had become, without his quite meaning it, to a kind of test he ran on the world over and over since the day his wife Elena had died, and taken with her the last reason he'd ever cared what strangers thought of his suits. "Well," Margaret said, "table 2 is reserved for immediate family and close business associates of the Harringtons. I do think, given the circumstances, it might be more comfortable for you at table 14, closer to the bar." She smiled the smile she used on people she'd already stopped seeing. No offense intended, of course. It's simply a matter of fit. The word landed exactly where she wanted it to land. Fit. Not wealth, not class, never anything so crude as that. Just fit. As though Daniel were a piece of furniture delivered to the wrong room. Claire's face went the color of the tablecloths. "Mom, Mrs. Harrington, he's my father. He's sitting with me." Claire, Ethan had appeared behind his mother's shoulder, tall and handsome and 29 years old, and in this precise moment, utterly incapable of finding a single word to put between his mother and the woman he loved. He looked at Daniel. He looked at his mother. He looked at his shoes. "It's fine," Daniel said before Claire could say anything else that would cost her something later. He touched his daughter's arm, the lightest pressure, a signal only she would fully understand. "Not here, not tonight, not like this. Table 14 is fine. I've sat in worse seats." He turned and walked toward the back of the ballroom, past the knot of catering staff, past the string quartet tuning up for the first dance. And he did not look like a man who had just been publicly demoted from his own daughter's wedding. He looked, if anything, faintly amused, the specific, dangerous amusement of a man who has been underestimated exactly this many times before and has never once found it to be a problem. What Margaret did not see, because she had already turned to greet the ambassador's wife, was the man standing near the bar in a gray suit that fit considerably better than Daniel's. A senior partner from the accounting firm that audited Harrington Manufacturing every year. His name was Aaron Cho, and his eyes, following Daniel across the ballroom, had gone very wide and very still. "Sir," Aaron said quietly when Daniel passed within a few feet of him. He caught himself immediately. Excuse me, do I know you from somewhere?" Daniel paused, looked at the young man's face. Recognized it, in fact, from a due diligence meeting 18 months earlier, a meeting Aaron had attended as a junior associate carrying binders for people who actually spoke. "I don't think so," Daniel said, and smiled and kept walking. Aaron Cho stood very still for a long moment, his champagne going warm in his hand, running through in his head exactly which face belonged to exactly which signature he had seen at the bottom of exactly which set of documents, the ones that determined every single year whether Harrington Manufacturing kept its credit line, kept its factory, kept its name on the building at all. At table 14, Daniel sat down next to an elderly aunt who talked about her hip replacement for 11 straight minutes, and he listened to every word of it. Because that was another thing he had learned in the years since he'd stopped being anyone important. The people at table 14 were, without exception, kinder than the people at table 2. He watched his daughter dance her first dance as a married woman in the arms of a boy who could not even now make himself walk 14 tables back to say a single word to the man who'd raised her. Daniel Reyes clapped along with everyone else and smiled the way a man smiles when he has already decided, quietly, that tonight is not the night. But that there will be a night, and it is coming faster than anyone in this room could possibly imagine. He hadn't come to this wedding empty-handed, whatever Margaret Harrington believed about the state of his finances. In an inner pocket of that unremarkable navy jacket sat a folded envelope, thin as a greeting card, that he had been carrying for 3 days without deciding whether he would ever need to open it in front of anyone. He had hoped he wouldn't. He was by nature, and by 20 years of hard-won practice, a man who preferred quiet solutions to loud ones. But he had learned a long time ago, the year he lost Elena, the year he'd watched grief try to convince him that nothing mattered anymore, that hope was not a strategy, and that some people only understood a fact once it was placed unavoidably in front of their eyes. The reception rolled on around him in its expensive, indifferent way. Waiters in white gloves moved between tables like a tide going out and coming back in. Somewhere near the dais, Robert Harrington was making a toast about legacy and family and the joining of 2 great houses, a phrase that made Daniel's mouth twitch because he happened to know, in numbers most of this room would never see, exactly how great one of those houses currently was. And it was not the number Robert thought it was. Claire found him again near 10 o'clock, slipping off her heels to sit beside him for 5 stolen minutes while the band took a break. Up close, without the crowd around her, the bride's composure cracked just slightly at the corners. "I'm sorry, Dad," she said. "I should have said something. I don't know. made her apologize, made Ethan say something. "You got married today," Daniel said. "That's the job. The rest of it isn't yours to carry." "It is, though." Claire looked down at her hands, at the ring that had cost more than the house she'd grown up in. "Ever since I told them you were, and I quote, in business semi-retired, she's been like this. Like she's trying to figure out what we're worth. Like she's doing math on us." Daniel went very still in the particular way he went still when something important had just walked past him disguised as small talk. "What kind of math?" "I don't know. Ethan says it's nothing. He says his mom's just protective." Claire's jaw tightened, and for a second she looked exactly like her mother had looked the year before the diagnosis, the year Elena had still believed she could out-argue anything, including cancer. "But I heard her on the phone last week. Something about the bank and a covenant and needing this wedding to read the right way before the end of the quarter. I didn't understand half of it." "Read the right way to whom?" "I don't know, Dad." Claire's eyes were shining now, and Daniel reached over and took her hand the way he had every single time she'd cried in front of him since she was 4 years old and had fallen off the porch steps chasing a stray cat. "I just want it to be simple. I want to be married to Ethan because I love him, not because his family needs our wedding photo for some I don't even know what. A press release." "It'll be simple," Daniel said. "I promise you that." He didn't tell her in that moment exactly how he intended to keep the promise. He had spent 20 years keeping Claire's world simple by removing himself quietly from every place where his name might complicate it. Tonight, for the first time since her mother's funeral, he was beginning to suspect that the world had other plans. Across the room, Aaron Cho had found Robert Harrington near the bar and was talking to him with the low, urgent posture of a man delivering news he wasn't sure he was allowed to deliver at a wedding. Robert's face over Aaron's shoulder went through 3 separate expressions in under 10 seconds. Confusion, disbelief, and something that looked from this distance uncomfortably close to fear. Daniel watched this without appearing to watch it the way he had once watched entire boardrooms without seeming to look at anyone at all. "I'm going to say goodnight to your husband," he told Claire, straightening his cheap, deliberate jacket. "Go dance. This is still your wedding." "Dad," she caught his sleeve before he could stand fully, "whatever this is with you tonight, the way people are looking at you, the way that accountant went white as a sheet, I don't need you to fix anything. I just need you to still be my dad tomorrow." Daniel Reyes looked at his daughter for a long moment, and something moved behind his eyes that hadn't moved in a very long while. Not since the last afternoon of Elena's life when she had made him promise, in a hospital room smelling of antiseptic and dying flowers, that he would let Claire have an ordinary life, even if it meant he never had one again. "I will always be your dad," he said. "Tomorrow and every day after that, no matter what anyone in this room decides to find out tonight." He kissed her forehead the way he had every night of her childhood, and walked toward the doors. Past table 2, past the seat that had been reserved for him, and then quietly, publicly, taken away. And if anyone had been watching closely, they might have noticed that he did not look, for even a second, like a man who had lost anything at all. 3 floors above the ballroom, in a suite the hotel had comped for the Harrington family as a courtesy, Margaret was on the phone before her son had even finished his first dance downstairs. Her voice pitched low and hard in a way she never let the guests hear. "I don't care what the quarterly report says, David. I need the Kestrel renewal signed before the board meets Thursday, not after." A pause. No, I understand the exposure. I'm telling you what I need, not asking what's convenient." Another pause, longer this time, and when Margaret spoke again, her voice had dropped almost to a whisper. The voice of a woman checking a door was closed, before saying something. "True. If Kestrel calls the loan, we lose the Ohio plant by spring. I am not going to let 200 jobs and my husband's name on that building disappear because some private equity fund got nervous. Fix it. She hung up, smoothed the front of her dress in the mirror, checked her lipstick, and rearranged her face into the expression she'd worn downstairs for the last 4 hours. Warm, gracious, faintly amused by the world. A woman who had never once in her life had to worry about anything as vulgar as money. She did not know that her son had been standing in the hallway outside the suite for the better part of a minute and had heard every word. Ethan Harrington had grown up understanding the way children absorb weather rather than facts, that his family's comfort was not to be questioned, examined, or discussed at dinner. There had been a year when he was 11, when the house had gone very quiet for several months and his father had stopped playing golf on Saturdays, and nobody had ever explained why. And Ethan had learned from that silence exactly how his family handled trouble, by pretending with total conviction that it did not exist. He did not go into the suite. He went back downstairs instead, past the check-in desk, past a bellhop wheeling a cart of extra champagne, and found Claire near the terrace doors alone for a moment, looking out at the dark garden, with an expression he recognized because he wore it himself most days, without knowing it. "Hey," he said. "Hey." She didn't turn around right away. "I'm sorry about my mother, tonight at the table. It wasn't okay." "No," Claire agreed. "It wasn't. I should have said something. You should have." He came and stood beside her at the railing, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, not quite finding the courage to close the last few inches. "I keep telling myself I'll say something the next time. And then the next time comes and I don't. My whole life I've watched people manage her instead of arguing with her. It's like arguing with weather. He's my father, Ethan, not weather. I know that. Do you?" Claire finally turned to look at him, and there was something in her face that he had never quite seen there before. Not anger exactly, but the specific, weary clarity of someone doing arithmetic she didn't want to do. "Because from where I was standing tonight, it looked like you'd rather let your mother humiliate my father in front of 200 people than risk one uncomfortable sentence with her." "That's not fair." "Maybe not, but it's what happened." He didn't have an answer for that, which was, in its own way, an answer. They stood together at the railing without speaking for a while, the band's music drifting out through the terrace doors, muffled and warm. A song meant for people who were happy. "Can I ask you something?" Ethan said eventually. "And you actually tell me the truth?" "Depends on the question." "Your dad, what does he actually do? I mean, actually. Because you've always been sort of vague about it, and I never pushed because it never seemed like it mattered. But tonight, my mother's been on the phone about the Ohio plant and some fund called Kestrel calling in a loan. And I don't know why, but for about 10 seconds down there, watching your dad walk to table 14, I had the strangest feeling that somehow all of that was connected." Claire looked at him for a long beat, weighing something. "I don't know everything," she said carefully. "He never talks about the years before I was 10. I know he used to travel constantly. I know we lived in a much bigger house once, before my mom got sick, and then after. After she died, he sold almost everything and we moved to a smaller place in Connecticut. And he started this whole new quiet life. Teaching me to ride a bike himself instead of hiring someone. Coaching my softball team. He said money had already cost him the one thing he actually cared about keeping. And he wasn't going to let it cost him me, too. That's not an answer to what he does." "I know," Claire said. "It's the only answer I've got. He built something once, I know that much. And then he walked away from it on purpose the week after the funeral, and he's never once told me what it was worth, or what it's called, or whether any of it is still his." Down the hallway, a door opened, and Margaret Harrington emerged from the family suite in a fresh coat of composure, ready to descend back into her son's wedding as though she had not just spent 4 minutes threatening a banker over the telephone. She saw Ethan and Claire at the terrace doors and smiled her wedding smile at them. The one with no weather in it at all. "There you two are," she said. "Ethan, darling, your father wants you for photographs. "Claire, sweetheart, you look radiant." Her eyes flicked almost imperceptibly toward the ballroom, toward table 14, toward the empty chair where Daniel Reyes had been sitting an hour ago before he'd quietly excused himself and gone up to his own room. "Has your father settled in all right? I do hope table 14 wasn't too noisy." "He's fine," Claire said in a voice so flat it could have been used to level a floor. "Good," Margaret said, already turning away, already thinking of the next thing, the next fire, the next number that needed to move before Thursday. "I'm sure he's used to finding his own way around by now." She didn't wait for a response. She walked back into her son's wedding with her chin high and her mind 3 floors up on a call she still needed to make. A covenant she still needed to fix a company that was, in ways, she had spent 11 years refusing to say out loud, standing on ground far less solid than the ballroom floor beneath everyone's dancing feet. Later that night, after the cake had been cut and the last guest had trickled out into a fleet of town cars, Aaron Cho sat alone at the hotel bar, nursing a whiskey he hadn't planned on ordering, running a search on his phone that he had absolutely no professional reason to run. Daniel R. Reyes. He typed the name into 3 different databases his firm had access to and found, as he'd more or less expected, almost nothing. A residential address in a modest Connecticut town. A defunct LLC from 11 years ago. A single old filing with the Securities and Exchange Commission that had been amended so many times it read more like a redaction than a document. But he also remembered because Aaron Cho had a memory built for exactly this kind of thing, which was why the firm kept him on the Harrington account in the first place. A name buried 3 layers down in Harrington Manufacturing's own capital structure. Not a name that appeared on letterhead. Not a name anyone at the company ever said out loud in meetings. A name that showed up only once a year in a single signature block on the annual renewal of a credit facility that Harrington Manufacturing depended on the way a body depends on blood. Kestrel Capital Partners. Managing member, D.R. He had seen that signature exactly twice. Both times in binders he wasn't technically supposed to be reading. Closely, both times signed with a hand he had thought at the time belonged to some faceless private equity executive he would never meet. Aaron finished his whiskey, paid the check, and did not sleep well that night. Not because he was certain of anything yet, but because some part of him, the part that had chosen accounting precisely because it rewarded people who paid close attention to small, easily overlooked details, was already almost certain, and was already afraid of what it would mean for a company he had audited for 6 years if he turned out to be right. The call came at 6:40 the next morning, while most of the wedding party was still asleep behind heavy hotel curtains, nursing champagne headaches and the particular exhaustion that follows a day built entirely out of performance. Margaret was already awake. She was always awake before anyone else in her family. It was, she believed, the only reason any of them still had a roof over their heads. She answered on the first ring, stepping out onto the suite's small balcony so Robert wouldn't stir. "Tell me you have good news," she said. The voice on the other end belonged to David Ferris, the Harrington family's longtime banking relationship manager, a man who had spent 15 years learning exactly how to deliver bad news to Margaret Harrington without losing his job in the process. "Margaret, I need you to understand this isn't coming from me. This is coming from the credit committee and above them from whoever actually holds the paper on the Ohio facility." "What paper? Say it plainly, David." Kestrel's renewal deadline moved up. They want confirmation of the covenant package by end of business Thursday, not end of quarter. And there's a new condition attached. They want a personal meeting with Robert before they'll sign off. Not a call, a meeting, in person. Margaret's knuckles went white around the phone's edge. Kestrel has never asked for an in-person meeting in 11 years. We've never even met anyone from Kestrel. It's always been documents, always been counsel, always been faceless. "I know," David said, and something in his voice made clear that he found this development at least as unsettling as she did. I don't know what's changed, but Margaret, if they call this loan instead of renewing it, we don't have 30 days to find a replacement lender. We have maybe 10. And I don't think I need to remind you what happens to the Ohio plant and to the stock price and to your husband's name on quarterly filings if that happens during your son's honeymoon. Margaret stood very still on the balcony, looking out over a garden she had, 12 hours earlier, considered slightly too modest a backdrop for wedding photographs. Below her, a groundskeeper was already at work trimming hedges that had been perfect the day before. "Find out who at Kestrel is pushing this," she said finally. "I want a name before Thursday." Margaret. "A name, David." She hung up before he could answer and stood there for a long moment with her jaw set, doing the particular arithmetic she had been doing, in one form or another, for 11 years. Since the year the Ohio expansion had gone catastrophically over budget, and Robert, rather than admit the mistake to the board, had quietly borrowed against the entire company's future to cover it. A decision Margaret had supported at the time and had spent every year since trying to make disappear. She went back inside and found her husband sitting up in bed watching her with the specific dread of a man who has learned over 3 decades of marriage exactly what his wife's face looks like when the numbers have stopped cooperating. "Kestrel," Robert said. It wasn't a question. "They want to meet you. In person. Thursday." Robert closed his eyes. "They've never wanted that before." "I know. What changed?" Margaret didn't answer right away because the honest answer that she genuinely did not know, and that not knowing frightened her more than almost anything had frightened her in years, was not a sentence she was in the habit of saying out loud, even to her own husband. Down the hall, in a much smaller room the hotel had given him without comment, Daniel Reyes was already dressed, already had coffee going, and was reading, on a laptop he rarely used anymore, an email from a man named Whitfield, who had been his attorney for the better part of 15 years, and who had, at Daniel's own explicit and long-standing instruction, never once contacted him about Kestrel business unless it was genuinely urgent. "Daniel, the Harrington file needs your attention. Ferris called our office directly, asking who at Kestrel is driving the accelerated review. I told him nothing per your standing instructions, but he's rattled. Also, and I want to flag this, clearly, Aaron Cho, senior manager at Whitmore & Cho, has requested a private meeting with our office regarding a matter of professional concern. I believe he may have recognized you last night. Advise." Daniel read the message twice, then set the laptop aside and looked for a long moment at a photograph on the nightstand. Elena, 26 years old, laughing at something just out of frame, taken the year before Kestrel had even existed. Back when Daniel had been nothing more than a young man with a good instinct for undervalued manufacturing companies and a wife who thought he worked too much. I built all of it for her, he thought, not for the first time. And then I buried almost all of it for Claire. He had not planned to reveal himself. He had planned quietly and privately to let his lawyers apply pressure through entirely conventional channels, call the loan due if the Harringtons' behavior toward his family continued. Let the numbers do what numbers do, without ever needing to sit in a room and watch anyone's face change. It was cleaner that way. It hurt Claire less, he had told himself. It kept his promise to Elena intact. But somewhere between the wedding reception and this cup of cooling coffee, something in him had shifted. Not toward anger exactly, but toward a plain, tired clarity. Claire had asked last night not to be protected from all of it. She had asked for it to be simple. He picked up his phone and called Whitfield. "I want the Thursday meeting," Daniel said when the lawyer picked up. "Not with lawyers standing in for me. Me in person with Robert Harrington across the table." There was a long pause on the other end. "Daniel, you haven't sat in a room like that in 11 years. "I know. Are you certain?" Daniel looked again at the photograph on the nightstand and then passed it out the window toward the wing of the hotel where his daughter was almost certainly still asleep, beside a husband who had not yet found the courage to say a single word in her father's defense. "They tried to erase me from my daughter's wedding because of the suit I wore," Daniel said. "Let's see what they do when they find out what's actually in my pocket." That afternoon, while the newlyweds were meant to be resting before their delayed honeymoon departure, Claire found herself instead sitting across from her Aunt Rosa in the hotel's nearly empty breakfast room, picking at a croissant she had no intention of finishing. "Your mother would have hated all this fuss," Rosa said, not unkindly. Rosa was Elena's older sister, sharp-tongued and unimpressed by wealth in the specific way of a woman who had grown up with very little of it and had decided decades ago that money was interesting mainly for what it revealed about the people who had it. She'd have hated the flowers, Claire agreed. $12,000 of orchids, Aunt Rosa? 12,000? Your father's never told you what he used to do, has he? Claire looked up sharply. What do you mean, used to do? Rosa hesitated, the particular hesitation of a woman who has kept a promise for a very long time and is beginning for the first time to wonder whether keeping it is still the right thing to do. Before you were born, before your mother got sick, your father wasn't the man who coaches softball and fixes his own gutters, Mija. He built something. A fund, big enough that when he walked away from it, people in 3 different countries wrote articles wondering why. Why did he walk away? Because your mother asked him to promise the week before she died that you would grow up loved for exactly who you were, and never once wonder if the people around you loved the money instead. He kept that promise so completely he practically erased himself to do it. Rosa reached across the table and took Claire's hand. I don't know exactly what happened last night at that wedding table, but I have a feeling watching your father's face this morning at breakfast that some of that erasing is about to come undone. Claire sat very still, feeling something shift into place in her chest. Not quite fear, not quite relief, but the specific, disorienting sensation of a life she thought she understood, revealing an entire hidden floor beneath the one she'd always lived on. Aunt Rosa, she said slowly. What was the fund called? Rosa looked at her for a long moment and then said the name quietly, almost gently, the way you tell someone something you know is about to change everything. Kestrel. Claire's croissant sat forgotten on its plate. Somewhere above her, on the balcony of a suite 3 floors up, her new mother-in-law was still trying to find out the very same name and had no idea at all how close and how impossibly far she already was from the answer. Thursday arrived gray and cold, the kind of New England morning that makes glass office towers look like they're made of ice. The meeting had been arranged for 10 o'clock in a conference room on the 31st floor of Harrington Manufacturing's Hartford headquarters, a room Robert had chosen specifically because its floor-to-ceiling windows looked out over the company's name. Spelled out in brushed steel letters on the building across the street, a small psychological reassurance he badly needed. Margaret arrived first in a charcoal suit that cost more than most people's cars, having spent the previous 3 days trying and failing to learn a single fact about who exactly they were about to meet. David Ferris had come up empty. Every inquiry into Kestrel Capital Partners had returned the same wall of silence it always had. An address that led to a law firm, a phone number that led to voicemail, a managing member listed only as D.R. on 11 years of identical, impeccably filed paperwork. It's probably some junior partner sent to look serious, Margaret told Robert in the elevator, mostly to convince herself. Private equity likes theater. This is theater. Robert didn't answer. He had not slept well in 3 nights, and it showed in the gray beneath his eyes and the way his hand trembled very slightly around his coffee cup. At 9:58, the conference room door opened and Daniel Reyes walked in, wearing the same navy suit he'd worn to the wedding. Pressed, now freshly cleaned, but unmistakably the same suit the one Margaret had personally decided 5 days earlier did not belong at her son's family table. For a full 3 seconds, nobody in the room said anything at all. You, Margaret said finally, the word coming out smaller than she'd intended. Mrs. Harrington. Daniel set a slim leather folio down on the table and took the seat directly across from Robert with the unhurried ease of a man who has sat at the head of exactly this kind of table more times than he could count. Mr. Harrington, thank you both for making time. I don't understand, Robert said slowly, looking between his wife and the man they'd both dismissed to table 14 5 nights earlier. Where is the Kestrel representative? We were told. I am the Kestrel representative, Daniel said. I'm also the founder, and as of 11 years ago, the sole managing member and controlling partner. He opened the folio and slid a single document across the polished table. The same signature block Aaron Cho had spent 3 sleepless nights confirming, matched now against a Connecticut driver's license photocopy, stapled beside it for the room's benefit. D.R. Daniel Reyes. Robert's face went the color of the conference room's pale gray carpet. Margaret did not move at all, which was for anyone who knew her far more alarming than if she had. That's not possible, she said. Kestrel has held our credit facility for 11 years. We've never once met me. Correct. Daniel folded his hands on the table. I stopped attending meetings personally the year my wife died. I let counsel and staff handle everything face-to-face because I no longer had any interest in being known or recognized or invited anywhere on the strength of what I was worth. I built a small, quiet life instead. I raised my daughter. I coached softball. I wore suits that did not draw attention because attention was the one thing I had decided once and for all not to want anymore. Claire. Margaret said the name landing in the room like something dropped from a great height. Claire is my daughter, yes. Daniel's voice remained perfectly level, but something in his eyes had sharpened the way a blade sharpens without ever seeming to move. The same Claire you had removed from her own family's wedding table 5 nights ago, Mrs. Harrington, along with me. The silence that followed had weight to it. The specific silence of 2 people watching in real time every piece of leverage they thought they possessed dissolve at once. I want to be very clear about something, Daniel continued before either of them could recover enough to speak. I am not here for revenge. I did not come to this meeting to enjoy watching your faces right now, though I understand if you don't believe that. I came because 5 nights ago your family made a judgment about a man based entirely on the cut of his jacket, and did it loudly enough and publicly enough to humiliate my daughter on the one day of her life she should never have had to defend her own father's worth to a room full of strangers. Mr. Reyes, Robert began, if we had known. You didn't ask, Daniel said, not unkindly, but without softening it either. That's the part that matters. Your wife looked at a 62-year-old man in a department store suit standing next to his own daughter and decided without a single question that he did not fit at her son's table. Not what he'd built, not what he'd survived, just the suit. Margaret opened her mouth, closed it again. For the first time in longer than Robert could remember, his wife appeared to have run entirely out of things to say. Here is what happens now, Daniel said, and reached into the folio for a second document. The covenant renewal marked up in his own hand, terms revised. Kestrel's board, myself, and 2 trustees who answer only to me will decide by Monday whether to renew your credit facility, restructure it, or call it due in full. I am not going to pretend the decision is separate from what happened at that wedding, because it isn't. It never could be, not for me. But I also will not let anger make this decision for me, because 200 people in Ohio have jobs that depend on a plant your husband nearly lost 11 years ago through no fault of theirs. And I have spent my whole life trying not to be the kind of man who lets other people pay for decisions they didn't make. He closed the folio. I'll have my answer for you by Monday morning, Daniel said, rising from his chair. In the meantime, Mrs. Harrington, I'd think very carefully about which seat you assign my daughter at your own family's table from now on. He walked out of the conference room without waiting for a response, leaving behind a silence so complete that neither Robert nor Margaret Harrington moved for nearly a full minute. Robert staring at the marked-up covenant document as though it might change what it said if he looked at it long enough, and Margaret staring at the closed door, doing for the first time in 11 years arithmetic she could not make come out in her own favor. Down in the lobby, Aaron Cho was waiting by the elevator banks, having been quietly asked by Daniel's office to attend as an independent witness to the meeting's outcome. He watched Daniel step out of the elevator, calm, unreadable, exactly as composed as he'd been walking to table 14 5 nights earlier. "Sir," Aaron said, and this time he did not correct himself. "For what it's worth, I'm sorry about the wedding. I should have said something that night." "You didn't owe me anything that night, Aaron," Daniel said, 3 miles away, who had no idea yet exactly what her father had just done, or exactly what it was about to cost every single person still sitting in that 31st floor conference room. The elevator carrying Robert and Margaret back down to the lobby moved in complete silence for 11 floors. "You knew," Margaret finally said, not looking at her husband. "Somewhere in there, some part of you suspected something wasn't right. You've been sick for 3 days. "I suspected the deadline moving up wasn't normal," Robert said. "I never suspected this. He's Claire's father. Ethan's father-in-law is Kestrel." Margaret pressed 2 fingers against her temple as though she could physically hold the last hour's revelations in place through sheer pressure. 11 years, Robert. 11 years we've been paying interest to a man whose daughter I sat at table 14. What are we going to do? "I don't know yet," Margaret said, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, she meant it entirely. Not a rhetorical admission designed to buy time while she quietly formed a plan, but a genuine, disorienting absence of one. "But I know we cannot go home and tell Ethan what happened in that room without also telling him what I said to that man at the wedding, and I do not know how to do that and still be someone he respects afterward." The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Neither of them moved to step out. "There's something else," Robert said quietly. "Something you need to know before Monday. About the Ohio expansion. About why the numbers have never quite recovered the way I told the board they would." Margaret turned to look at her husband properly for what felt like the first time in years, and saw beneath the composed exterior he wore even now, even here, a fear she recognized because she had been carrying an almost identical version of it herself for 11 years. "Tell me in the car," she said, "not here." They stepped out into the lobby together, and for once, walking past the brushed steel letters spelling out their own family's name. Neither of them looked entirely certain that the name would still mean what it had meant that morning by the time Monday came. Robert Harrington told his wife everything in the car, and by the time they reached the house, Margaret understood 2 things with complete clarity. That her husband had been hiding the true depth of the Ohio losses from her for years, funneling short-term loans against future contracts that hadn't materialized, and that the only reason the company hadn't already collapsed was a private equity fund whose founder she had personally humiliated at their son's wedding 5 days earlier. She did not sleep that weekend. On Monday morning, before Kestrel's decision was due, Margaret Harrington did something she had not done in over a decade of marriage into money. She drove herself, alone, without an assistant, without a lawyer, to the small Connecticut address her private investigator had found for Daniel Reyes. And she knocked on the front door of a modest colonial house with a basketball hoop bolted crookedly over the garage. Daniel opened the door himself. He was in jeans and an old sweater, and for a moment he simply looked at her, saying nothing, the way he had looked at Delphine, the wedding planner, 5 nights earlier, not with hostility, but with the specific patience of a man who has learned to let silence do work that words often can't. "Mrs. Harrington," he said finally, "may I come in?" "Well, that depends on why you're here." Margaret's composure, so carefully maintained for 11 years, cracked visibly for the first time. "I came to apologize. properly, not in front of my husband, not in front of a boardroom, not because Kestrel's decision is due today. Though I won't pretend that isn't part of why I found the courage to actually knock on this door instead of sending a card. Well, then you'd better come in, Daniel said and stepped aside. They sat in his kitchen, plain oak table, mismatched chairs, a refrigerator covered in photographs of Claire at every age, from 6 to 26. And Margaret looked around at the smallness of it, the deliberate ordinariness, and understood in a way she hadn't fully allowed herself to understand before exactly how completely this man had chosen to disappear. I judged you by your suit, she said. I've spent 11 years building a life around the idea that people who matter look a certain way, dress a certain way, sit at certain tables. And I looked at you at your daughter's wedding, and I decided everything about you in under 30 seconds, and I was catastrophically wrong. And I humiliated your daughter to do it. You were, Daniel agreed. He didn't soften it. You were wrong, and you did humiliate her. Margaret flinched, but didn't look away. I know. Why are you really here, Margaret? Daniel used her first name for the first time, and something about it seemed to cost her more than any accusation would have. Kestrel's decision comes at noon. You could have waited for the call like everyone else. You didn't have to drive out here yourself. Because I needed you to know it wasn't only about the loan, Margaret said. And her voice, for the first time in this entire story, actually shook. My husband has been hiding losses from me for years from the board, from everyone. And I have spent 11 years being the person who holds this family together through sheer force of will. Because I genuinely believed that if I stopped being ruthless for even one day, everything we'd built would collapse. I built an entire personality around never being caught unprepared. And then I stood in a ballroom and made a judgment call about a stranger in a suit in under 30 seconds with the same ruthless certainty I use for everything else. And it turned out to be the single worst decision I've made in 11 years of decisions. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly on the table. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, he said finally. It isn't. My daughter came to me the morning after her own wedding, asking why her new mother-in-law looked at her father like he was furniture. That doesn't go away because you drove out here in your good coat and said the right words in my kitchen. I know that. But I also know something about being the person who holds a family together through sheer force of will, Daniel said more quietly now. I did that too for a while right after Elena died, right up until I realized that Claire didn't need me to hold everything together. She needed me to actually be there, imperfectly plainly in a cheap suit, if that's what it took, rather than perfectly, from a distance. Margaret looked down at her hands. Kestrel's decision, Daniel said, was never really about revenge, whatever you assumed walking in here. It was about whether I was willing to let 200 people in Ohio lose their jobs to teach your family a lesson about manners. I decided 3 days ago that I wasn't. The facility renews restructured with conditions Robert is not going to enjoy, but will survive. A payment schedule tied to actual performance instead of promises. And the board seat for an independent director who isn't afraid of your husband. And me? Margaret asked. What happens with me? That, Daniel said, was never mine to decide. That's between you and your son's family, starting with an actual conversation with your granddaughter-in-law. Not a card, not a gesture, an actual conversation, where you say to her exactly what you said to me just now, without the excuse of a business deadline hanging over it. The obstacle came 2 days later when Margaret tried to have exactly that conversation with Claire, and it went by any measure badly. She arrived at Claire and Ethan's new apartment unannounced, carrying an enormous bouquet that Claire, standing in the doorway in sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, looked at the way you'd look at a bill you already knew you couldn't pay. I'd like to talk, Margaret said. I don't think I'm ready for that, Claire said honestly. I've had 5 days to think about the fact that you had me and my father moved to the back of my own wedding. And about 3 days to learn that you and Ethan both knew before I did exactly how much financial trouble your family was actually in, and neither of you told me. I'm not sure flowers fix any of that. They're not meant to fix it, Margaret said. I don't think anything fixes it quickly. I came because I owe you an apology I haven't given properly yet, and because... She stopped, visibly searching for words she hadn't rehearsed, which for Margaret Harrington was itself an admission. Because I am trying very badly to learn how to do this differently, and I don't actually know how. Then maybe start by not showing up unannounced, expecting me to make it easy, Claire said, and closed the door gently, but completely, leaving Margaret standing alone on the landing with an armful of flowers nobody had asked for. It was not the ending Margaret had hoped for, and she stood there for a long moment, feeling for the first time and longer than she could remember, entirely without a strategy. No phone call to make, no number to move, no leverage to apply. She left the flowers on the doormat and drove home in silence, and that night, for the first time in 11 years, she told Robert the truth about how frightened she actually was. Of her son, of her daughter-in-law, of the version of herself that had looked at a stranger in a cheap suit and decided instantly that he did not belong. It took another week of small, unglamorous efforts. A handwritten letter Claire didn't answer for 4 days. A lunch Margaret sat through without once mentioning money or business. A genuine, halting apology to Daniel, delivered a second time. This time with Ethan present to hear it, before Claire finally agreed to see her again, not because the debt was repaid, but because the effort, unlike the flowers, had actually cost Margaret something real. The final evening came together almost by accident, the way the truest reconciliations often do. Not staged, not announced, but assembled out of small, ordinary decisions that happened to land in the same kitchen at the same time. Daniel had come to Claire and Ethan's apartment to help fix a leaking faucet Ethan had been putting off for 2 weeks because some habits showing up with a wrench instead of a lecture did not change no matter how many boardrooms a man had once controlled. Claire was making dinner, badly, the smoke alarm going off twice before she gave up and ordered pizza instead, laughing at herself in a way Ethan hadn't heard in the 5 days since the wedding. You could have told me, Ethan said, sitting across from her at the small kitchen table while Daniel worked under the sink in the next room. About your dad, about Kestrel, any of it. I didn't know most of it myself, Claire said. But you're right that there's a version of this where I told you more earlier instead of just hoping it would never come up. I think some part of me was scared that if your family knew what my dad used to be worth, it would change how you all looked at me. And then your mother looked at him at our wedding and decided he was worth nothing at all. And it turned out I'd been protecting the wrong thing the whole time. I should have said something at that table, Ethan said. That night. I keep replaying it. I had 10 seconds where I could have stood up and told my mother she was wrong. And I didn't, because I've spent my whole life being afraid of exactly that conversation with her. And I let that fear cost you something that should have belonged only to us. Then don't let it cost us again, Claire said, reaching across the small table and taking his hand. Not a grand gesture, not a scripted vow, just her fingers closing around his steady. That's actually all I want, Ethan. Not an apology for what already happened. A promise about what happens the next time your mother is wrong about something in front of me. I promise, Ethan said, and for the first time since the wedding, it did not sound like a boy managing his mother's weather. It sounded like a man making a decision. From the next room, Daniel called out, "Faucet's fixed. Try it now." Claire turned the tap, and clean water ran without a single drip, and she laughed, really laughed, the kind that reached her eyes for what felt like the first time in a week. Her father came in wiping his hands on a dish towel, and looked at his daughter and her husband sitting together at the small table, hands still joined, and felt something in his chest settle into place that had been unsettled since the moment Delphine, the wedding planner, had put her hand on his elbow and called him sir in a tone that meant something else entirely. "I got a call from Whitfield this afternoon," Daniel said. "Kestrel's board finalized the restructuring. Your father-in-law keeps his company, Ethan. 200 people in Ohio keep their jobs. And an independent director I trust starts sitting in on Harrington board meetings next quarter, which I suspect your parents are going to find considerably more useful than either of them currently believes." "And Margaret?" Claire asked quietly. "That part isn't mine to finish," Daniel said. "That part is yours." He looked at his daughter, 26 years old, married, now sitting in a small kitchen with clean water finally running from a fixed faucet, and thought of Elena and the promise he had made her in a hospital room a lifetime ago, that Claire would grow up loved for exactly who she was, and would never have to wonder whether the people around her loved something else instead. He had kept that promise imperfectly in a cheap navy suit at the back of a ballroom, exactly the way he'd intended to keep it all along. "I'm proud of you," he told her, and meant every word of it, and did not need for the first time in a very long while to say anything more than that. If that boardroom scene gave you chills, don't just scroll past. Tell me in the comments. Do you think Margaret actually changed? Or is she just wearing a softer version of the same control she's always had? And be honest, would you have forgiven her as fast as Claire did? Or made the in-laws work a lot harder for it? Hit like if that twist hit exactly the way you wanted it to. Subscribe so you never miss the next CEO family drama story. And share this with someone who needs a reminder that quiet people are often the ones holding all the power. Drop your favorite trope in the comments: secret heir, marriage of convenience, ex who comes back richer than ever, because the next story just might be written from your suggestion.